right, then we are ready to begin. Dr. Ouma, if you would introduce our lecturer for today, that would be very nice.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great honor and joy to introduce our distinguished Professor, Dr. Patrick Zoll, S.J., a Jesuit priest and erudite philosopher and a leading voice in contemporary metaphysical and ethical thoughts. He currently serves as Professor of Metaphysics at the Munich School of Philosophy in Germany. Professor Zoll earned his habilitation in Christian philosophy from University of Innsbruck and his PhD from the University of Bonn, both with the highest distinction, summa cum laude. His research spans metaphysics, political philosophy, and philosophy of religion, with a particular emphasis on the thought of Thomas Aquinas and the enduring dialogue between faith and reason in our modern world. He is the author of several acclaimed works, including What is It to Exist? And Perfectionist Liberalism, Why Neutrality is a False Ideal in Political Justification. The latter publication earned him Karl Alba Prize for Outstanding Philosophical Scholarship. Beyond the classroom, Professor Zoll has lectured and engaged in dialogue across continents, spanning from Oxford to St. Louis University, bringing intellectual rigor and moral insight into the global stage. In the African philosophical tradition, the Kenyan sage philosopher Henry Odera Oruka reminds us that the true sage is not only learned, but also wise. Someone who uses reason to illuminate life and guide humanity towards the good. By that, Professor Zoll stands among the living sages of our time, a thinker whose wisdom bridges the ancient modern to the Western, from metaphysics to moral. As an African proverb beautifully says, wisdom is like a baobab tree. No person can embrace it alone. Yet today, we gather around a man who helps us to see just a little further into the vast tree of wisdom. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a warm, heartfelt welcome to Professor Dr. Patrick Zoll, a scholar, a sage, a true friend of thought and humanity. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for this very, very kind and very nice and honoring introduction. So if ever there is something like a Nobel Prize for philosophers and I have to pick someone to do the eulogy, I will surely ask you, because that already was something worthy of a Nobel Prize for philosophers or something. So thank you very much for this very kind and also very interesting introduction, which I fully agree with this wisdom from your African tradition and your thinkers. Okay, with that, let us start today with the third lecture on the topic of divine simplicity, just to recapitulate a little bit where we stand. So I started with an objection and to think, well, why should we care about divine simplicity? Why should we spend energy and time to trying to understand what that means? And I showed you that, at least from the Catholic tradition, and especially from Thomas Aquinas, an authoritative figure in the Catholic tradition, he says, well, we should care because human flourishing depends on certain knowledge of God's essence and nature. And the doctrine of divine simplicity is, well, probably one of the most fundamental doctrines which teaches something which is a key and opens us a door to understand probably everything else in the whole Christian tradition, what we want to know and think, how we should think about God's essence and nature. So in the second lecture, then I try to show you that it's interesting to deal with the topic of divine simplicity, because in the contemporary literature, if you look up what that means, the doctrine of divine simplicity, you can find quite prominently is a view which says, well, divine simplicity, a commitment to the doctrine of divine simplicity, amounts to something like a radical negative theology, which basically says to you, well, we can at best know what God is not, but we cannot have any knowledge of what God is by his essence and nature. Well, and we dived into a little bit again into Aquinas and his engagement with Maimonides, a Jewish medieval thinker, which Aquinas knew very well. His writings, he knew his writings very well. And I showed you that why Aquinas thinks that that is a mistaken view and that is not implied by the doctrine of divine simplicity. So today, what I want to talk about is, well, how can we then know the essence of a simple God? And what I'd like to show you is, again, show you that it's very beneficial to turn to classical authors, which are authoritative figures into the Catholic tradition, like Thomas Aquinas, because we can learn very interesting things which are relevant for our contemporary debates and challenges we are facing. And so basically what I want to show to you, you can find and read by your own. It's again in Aquinas' questions, disputed questions on God's power, Questiones disputate de potentia. You can find that all in the internet, for example, Aquinas.cc. And so what I want to do today is a little bit of a kind of comment, or what I see in these texts, how I understand in these texts, and hopefully you can then, by reading them by your own, also see what I see, and hopefully see that's pretty cool stuff what he's saying there, and very helpful for contemporary issues. So let's start. So Aquinas, to understand an Aquinas, it's important to understand, well, he's a very synthetic thinker. So he's not only very familiar with Aristotle and Aristotle's thought, but he also synthesizes all what was before him, also the patristic authors like John of Damascene and especially Dionysius, into a great synthesis, which is very powerful. And so what's interesting in the questions on Questiones disputate de potentia, and I'm now referring to question 7, article 5, of which I spoke already in the preceding lecture, is there you can see how he brings together a Dionysian, a Neoplatonic, Christianly interpreted Neoplatonic metaphysics of participation and of causality, how he brings that together with an Aristotelian theory of cognition. And then something very interesting results, which is undermining and challenging some contemporary presuppositions epistemological presuppositions. Okay, let's start. How can we know something about God's essence and nature? Again, we cannot define God. We do not have knowledge of him in that sense, but we can know at least something about God's nature and essence, the essence or nature of a simple God. So how does it work? Let us begin with the metaphysics. And a very important principle for Aquinas can be stated as follows. Every agent or cause can act and bring something into existence by its acting, namely an effect, inasmuch as that agent or cause is in actuality. So that sounds not very interesting at first hand, but it has very important implications. So first of all, it's interesting to look at his vocabulary. He says acting, so agere. He does not say creating. And why not? We see that because he wants to compare how God acts as an agent or cause and how we ourselves, we are also agents or causes who can bring something into existence. So second principle, and that's a very important principle, and it's very basic, and I think I cannot explain all the details in it. I just scratch at the surface, but it's very powerful and very important. So this principle says, well, if an agent or cause brings an effect into existence by its acting, the effect is similar to the cause. So that's interesting. So for example, when we say that there is a similarity between effect and cause, we can see that, for example, when a cat produces cats, brings cats into existence, but not mice, or a dog brings dogs into existence by reproducing itself, and human beings, of course, human beings. So that's because we have the power to do so, and that power is limited by what kind of esse we have, what kind of actuality. We are in actuality as human beings and have the form of a human being, and therefore we have the power to reproduce, to generate human beings, dogs, cats, trees, and so on. And so you see, there is a certain similarity between what is brought into existence, between the form of the cause and the form of the effect which is brought into existence. So now he says a third step in his metaphysics. He says, well, the existence of an effect which is similar to its cause requires that the form of the effect which exists in the effect exists in some mode also in the agent or cause. So that's just an implication of what I said before. So if I say by my if a dog by acting generates another dog, so the offspring as a dog has a form of a dog. Of course, in itself, it's a dog, and there is a similarity because the effect is similar. I mean, the puppy is similar to the parent dog. So there is, of course, a similarity of forms in the parent dog and in the puppy dog, let's say. So similarly speaking. So he sees, so the similarity which we can observe in reality, which occurs when something brings something else into existence, the similarity is explained by the fact that one and the same form is in the agent, in the cause, and in that which is brought into existence in the effect. So now, but Aquinas then says in a fourth step, so it's important now to see that the form of the effect which exists can exist in one of the following two ways in the cause or agent by which it is brought into existence. So he says we have two cases. So first of all, he says, well, it's possible that the equality of the power of the effect and the power of the cause to bring something into existence requires that the form of the effect exists in the effect in the same mode as it exists in the cause or effect. So the equality requires that the form of the effect exists in its cause or agent as specifically the same form. That's the first case. Now, there you can distinguish from that a second case where you say, well, the inequality of the power of the effect and the power of the cause to bring something into existence requires that the form of the effect exists in the effect not in the same mode as it exists in the cause or agent. That means that the inequality requires that the form of the effect exists in its cause or agent not as specifically the same form, but rather in a mode that exceeds the mode of how the form exists in the effect. So let us spell out that a bit more with an example. So you can see, for example, in Aquinas cosmology, let's take fire. So, for example, a fire generates another fire. So, I don't know, a bush is burning, and then the fire in the bush produces a fire in a tree besides the bush or something like that. Yeah, so you have two fires. Yeah, so you can say the fire in the tree, which comes later, is generated by the fire in the bush. Well, and they are similar insofar as the fire now in the tree has the power to generate a fire, for example, in the house, which stands next to the tree, and so on. So you see there is a similarity of the fire in the tree to the fire in the bush by which it is caused. And this similarity is based on the similarity of powers. You can see that there is a similarity of form because each fire has the same power to generate another fire. Yeah? And so you have specifically the same form, namely the form of fire, which is in all these agents, in all these causes of fire. So it's equal. The power is equal, and therefore the form exists in the very same way in the different fires. Yeah. But now let's have a look at the second case where we have inequality. So there we have also similarity between an effect and its cause, but without an equality of the powers on which the similarity is based. So what could that be? So again, in Aquinas' worldview, let's have a fire. Let's have a fire in a bush which is caused by the sun. Yeah, the sun shines and somehow incends fire in a bush. Yeah, so he says, well, the sun and the fire are similar insofar as they both have the power to generate further fire. Yeah, so the sun and the burning bush are similar insofar as they both have the power to generate further fire. But according to the Aristotelian cosmology, which Aquinas accept, the sun has not only the power to generate fire, but the sun is more powerful. It's unequal in power because it also has the power to produce a multiplicity of other effects. So, for example, in Aquinas' Aristotelian view, the sun is responsible or co-responsible for the generation of plants and animals, to let plants flourish. Well, and some of these things, of course, we know also by modern science. For example, the sunlight is necessary for photosynthesis and stuff like that. So the point is here that there is a similarity of the power of a fire and the power of the sun. Both have the power to generate fire, which requires that the form of fire exists in the fire, which exists in fire, also exists in the sun. However, you have also an inequality of the powers of the sun and of the fire to bring something into existence, which requires that there is a dissimilarity which, with respect to the modes in which the form of fire exists in the sun and in, for example, the fire in the bush. So, for example, the form of fire must exist in the sun in a mode that exceeds the mode of how the form exists in the fire, namely a mode which does not determine or restrict the actuality or esse of the sun to the form of fire. Yeah, so the sun must have esse which is not restricted only to the esse which the form of fire gives you, because otherwise the sun would only be able to produce according to the form of fire. But as we have just seen, the sun can cause many other effects. So there must be the form of fire must exist in the sun in such a way that it restricts the esse, the actuality of the sun, not to the form of fire. So the fifth step is, of course, to say the power of any effect to bring something into existence is unequal to the power of its first cause or agent. That means to God to bring something into existence. So, I mean, that's of course a point which hopefully you very much agree to, that God as a cause or agent is of course much more powerful than any other created agent. So, for example, any created thing has only the power to bring a certain kind of form or of effect into existence by its acting. So, for example, a goat is in actuality in virtue of its goat form and has consequently only the power to generate goats by its acting. But if we compare that to God, the power of God as a first agent or cause of everything created is unequal to the power of any effect of God's creative action. Well, why is that the case? Because God's actuality is not restricted by any form as it is in the case of any creature, due to the fact that any creature is not esse by its essence, but only participates in esse. But God is the fullness of esse. Therefore, in him, or his power is not restricted by any thing, any creaturely form we can observe and imagine. So that means now in the sixth step, so that to say we have clearly an inequality of power of the divine effect to bring something into existence by its acting, and God's power to bring something into existence. So, and this requires, and this is an application of the former principle, if we have that inequality, that requires that the form of any divine effect exists in the divine effect, not in the same mode as it exists in the divine agent or cause. That means the inequality requires that the form of the divine effect exists in the divine cause or agent, not as specifically the same form, but rather exists in the divine cause in a mode that exceeds the mode of how the form exists in the divine effect. And we can probably understand that in analogy to the case of the sun, that we see, well, the form of fire somehow exists in the sun, but it must exist in the sun in a different way than it exists in the fire in the bush, because the sun can produce many more effects. And something along these lines, an analogy to this case, we can think, well, the forms of anything created we can observe, dogs, cats, human beings, trees, water, gold, and so far, exist in God insofar as it is an effect of God's creative activity. God gives esse to these of these things, and the forms these things have received esse from God. But in the things, these forms exist in a way which restrict, for example, the coexistence of other forms. So, for example, if you're a human being, you're not a donkey. Yeah? So you can't have the form of a human being and a donkey at the same time. So, however, in God, these forms exist in a different mode, namely a mode which does not conflict with his being simple. So it does not introduce a real distinction in him, but these forms exist in a form, well, Aquinas call this in a unified way. So these forms can exist, the divine ideas can exist in God, in God's essence or nature, in a form which does not include any kind of restriction or limitation on his paths. So now the interesting thing is, now if we apply that to our understanding of created reality, what Aquinas tells us is to say, he says, look, when God creates something, brings something into existence by the principles we've just seen, by creating, he makes that what he creates similar to himself, to his power, and so on. So, and therefore, because God's power is identical with his essence, and his essence is simple, he says to us, well, by creating, he makes all that what he creates in some way similar to his divine essence or nature. It bears a certain similarity to God's essence and nature, to the simplicity of God's essence of nature, in virtue of the fact that the form of any divine effect exists in the power of its divine cause. So that's very interesting. By creating, God makes, he leaves a stamp, you could say, of himself in everything which he creates. Yeah. Um, so this is the metaphysical part, which is draws heavily on Dionysius and interpretation of Dionysius, and also Dionysius' interpretation of Neoplatonic sources. So there you have what you can call a metaphysics of participation, a metaphysics of causality, which works in that way that, yeah. So now it's interesting, Aquinas in his writings combines that with an Aristotelian, basically Aristotelian theory of cognition. So again, unfortunately, I have not the time to expand on that here, but so just let me give you the basic idea. Hopefully it comes clear how this works. So Aquinas says, how do we understand reality? How do we cognize reality and understand anything? So he says, so he says a human intellect, for example, gains knowledge of forms or perfections such as wisdom, power, or goodness, which are found in creatures, by being informed through what he called species of these perfections. And in this process, the human intellect is made similar to the forms or perfections found in creatures by the exercise of its powers. So, for example, I see here a lot of faces, and I see a lot of wisdom. Yeah? I cognize wisdom by the way how you speak, by the questions you pose. So I cognize somehow perfections such as wisdom or goodness in creatures. And how do I know that? Is, for example, by species. And while that's a very complicated process, but somehow for example, the wisdom which is in you, I mean, I see that through sense experience and then also to my active intellect. So I form in myself the idea and the form of perfection. Yeah. And that's so it's due to an activity of the intellect and so we have also a similarity, for example, through this process of cognition, in which the senses, the external senses and the internal senses play an important part. So somehow in this complicated process, I have the form of wisdom which is in you, I have in my mind. And so there is a similarity between the wisdom which is in you and works in you and makes you wise in actuality, and the form of wisdom which is in my intellect. Yeah, and so due to the similarity and this process, I have assimilated myself, I made myself similar to the cognized object, you can say. I've been conformed to so the knowing intellect is conformed to the known thing. That's the important point here. So what's interesting is here that you also have a process of assimilation, but the direction of the process of assimilation in human cognition is reversed to the process of assimilation that takes place if a cause or agent such as God or the sun brings an effect into existence. So you can say the human intellect is made similar to reality in the process of cognition in virtue of the fact that the same forms exist in reality and in the cognizing intellect as a result of the activity of the human intellect, the exercise of our cognizing power. So there is a formal identity, you can say, and consequently a similarity between the cognizing intellect and the cognized thing in virtue of the fact that the same forms or perfections exist in creatures and in the cognizing intellect. But the forms, again, do not exist in the same mode in creatures and in the intellect that cognizes them. So the mode of their existence depends on that in which they are received. So for example, in material substances, the forms or perfections are received in matter, that means materially, which means that they configure the matter of the substance of which they are forms. So however, the forms or perfections which are received materially in created things are received immaterially in the power that cognizes them in the human intellect. So why is that important? It is important because you can say I conform myself to reality. We have a similarity of forms. I assimilate myself to reality, for example, by cognizing goodness in Mother Teresa. But unfortunately, by just cognizing goodness in Mother Teresa, I'm not becoming myself good. Yeah, that's not enough. Or by cognizing a donkey and cognizing the form of a donkey, I do, of course, not become a donkey. I mean, because the form of the donkey is not materially received by my cognizing power. That's important. You can think about it like what he means species, species or something like that, like encoded information. So through our senses, external and internal senses, we work like scanners. Yeah, so we scan reality and then reproduce the information which is encoded in the things. We see the you can say the QR codes, like the forms which actually work in material things and configure the matter, and so we just scan them, and so it does not configure our matter, but we get the information which we receive through this QR codes or something like that. I think you get the idea. It's of course a much more complicated thing, but I think that's the basic idea you get. Now that's now interesting. If we bring these two things together, I just said, so God creates everything and makes everything similar to how the things are in his mind. Yeah, so they bear a certain similarity to God's simple essence or nature. So now I just explained with the Aristotelian theory of cognition, we say, well, we ourselves cognize things by making ourselves similar to reality. Now you can draw the conclusion by yourselves. I mean, if reality bears some similarity to God, to God's essence or nature, and we ourselves in our mind conform ourselves to reality by cognizing the forms which are in the things, and so that we have a similarity of the form of the things, the same form in our mind. By cognizing reality, we also conform us to how God is in itself, to his essence or nature, to his simple essence or nature. And this is, I think, the basic idea that he says, if we really are in contact with reality and cognize things and do not make mistakes, so by cognizing, for example, the forms and perfections and powers of things which are in reality, we also learn something, have some kind of knowledge of God's essence or nature, because these things which these forms which exist in things bear a certain similarity to God's essence or nature, to the forms, to the divine ideas which exist in God's essence or nature. But an important thing is also to have in mind here. We just said that the forms of the things which exist in the things exist in the things in a different way as they exist in God's mind, yeah, in God Himself. And that's important because in God they exist in an unrestricted, unlimited way, and in the things they exist in a different way, in a restricted way which imposes limitation and so on. So that means for this reason, by learning something about created reality, and for example, by learning something about created wisdom or created goodness, there's always some kind of dissimilarity involved. Also, we cannot say God is just, it's not a matter of degrees that we can scale it up and say, well, God is like powerful or good, but just on a different scale or degree. There's also always some kind of, He exceeds the way that, for example, we can experience wisdom or goodness or life or what anything else in the world. However, still it remains true that there is a certain similarity. So it remains true to say that God is wise, God is life, God is powerful, and so on. And this similarity, this remaining similarity, despite of the always also the dissimilarity which we have to take into account, that is, in my point of view, the bridge, the ontological foundation which allows us to speak analogically about God. And this explains why that works. Because the trick of analogy is, of course, always to say you have some kind of relation, some kind of similarity, but also taking into account fundamental dissimilarity. And that's the trick here too. And now we also see how Aquinas gets these two views together. So as we have seen, he agrees with Maimonides in the sense that he says, well, in this life, in statu viae, we do not see the essence of God. We do not have knowledge of God in such a way that we can comprehend God, that we can define Him. And this is due to the case that we cannot directly cognize Him. We cannot directly see God. We have to take the indirect route via the creation. But as we have seen, the forms of things in creation which provide us with some kind of knowledge of God exist in created things in a different mode than they exist in God. And this also explains why we always only have imperfect knowledge of the divine essence. So this is Aquinas' position, that he says, yes, we can have knowledge of positive knowledge of what God is. We are not limited only to negative statements, but we are never in a position to say, well, we have knowledge of God in the sense that we can define Him. All our knowledge is somehow imperfect. But again, this imperfection does not leave us with a agnostic or skepticistic or relativistic view. We can indeed have some kind of positive knowledge, although always knowing that that knowledge is imperfect. It's always limited due to the mode of how we cognize how the mode of how we have knowledge of God, namely by means of species, that means of by means of forms of forms which exist in created things which exist in our mind. Yeah, so due to this, the way how cognition works for Aquinas, and due to the difference of how the forms and perfection of things exist in created things and in God, we all the knowledge we have of God's essence or nature is always imperfect knowledge of God's essence and nature. And I will conclude so to say that therefore it is true that Aquinas is careful and say, well, we cannot just read off from reality how God is in himself, and we have to be careful. We have always say that our knowledge of God is limited. God is always greater than we can imagine, that we can think of him. And therefore, we have to be very careful in how we speak about God, and always be aware that he transcends all our conceptions we can form of him. However, so in this sense, he accepts negative theology. But what I want to end with is to say it's a very mitigated negative theology, which is different from the one he attributes to Maimonides. And therefore, if you read Aquinas in certain places where he seems to affirm such kind of radical negative theology, it must be interpreted on the background of his other metaphysical and epistemological commitments. So, for example, let's take text 11 you have on your handout. I will read it. It's a typical text, for example, which is often cited as a textual evidence that he is embracing some kind of radical negative theology. So I read the text 11. It is because human intelligence is not proportionate to the divine substance that this same divine substance surpasses our intellect and thus is unknown to us. This is why man reaches the highest point of his knowledge about God when he knows that he does not know him, inasmuch as he knows that that which is God transcends whatever he understands about him. Okay, so far that sounds pretty negative theology, pretty apathetic. However, I would claim, and I hope it has become clear in what I said in the previous minutes, in contrast to scholars who cite the very same text as evidence for their claim that Aquinas is committed to radical apathetic theology or agnosticism, the context of the text makes clear that such an interpretation is untenable. I think what Aquinas wants to say here is just that modesty is required when it comes to knowledge of what God is, because our intellect is not and cannot be perfectly conformed to God. So a human being reaches the highest point of his knowledge about God when he knows that he knows not know him perfectly, because he recognizes the imperfection and limits of his own knowledge about what God is. However, this recognition does not imply a commitment to the claim that we cannot have any positive knowledge about God's essence or nature. Otherwise, you see, Aquinas' whole argument against Maimonides, for example, would collapse and would not make sense, or he would contradict and undermine all his metaphysics of participation, of metaphysics of causality, and also not square well with his Aristotelian theory of cognition. Rather, this highest knowledge builds upon positive knowledge of God or God's essence or nature, which results from the conformity of the human intellect to God's essence or nature. So the human intellect can positively know something about God's essence or nature in virtue of the intelligible species of creaturely forms or perfections, which as divine effects are similar to the form or perfections which exist in their cause, namely in God's power, which is identical with God's essence. So again, God's transcendence does not undermine the possibility that we can conform our intellect to God's essence and consequently can have some positive knowledge of what God is by his essence or nature. So I would like to conclude with text 12, which I think has to be read in conjunction with text 11, which I just read. So look at text 12 in your handout. It says, God eludes the form of our intellect as transcending every form that our intellect conceives of him. Well, okay, so much, so far, so good. But then he qualifies and he says, yes, but not such that our intellect in no way becomes like him according to any intelligible form. So he says, yes, it's true. God always, our conception of God always transcends the image. So God transcends all our conceptions we can make of him. However, this transcendence does not exclude that we can conform our intellects to God by means of the perfections which we cognize in created things. So there is a possibility to have imperfect knowledge of God's essence and nature, and there you see that that's an interesting middle way. He takes here a middle road between a radical apophaticism, radical negative theology, and you could say a naive way of saying, or a way which is also false, to say we can define God, we can have knowledge of God in such a way that we can comprehend and we see God already in this life. And just briefly, I think what I explained here, I mean, if you're trained a little bit in philosophy and contemporary philosophy, you see, I mean, that's really exciting, I think, here, because you see that's a very different worldview than what you are sold by modern epistemology or modern metaphysics, which, for example, we just had that yesterday. If you're a Kantian and you say, I cannot even have knowledge of reality, I mean, then you see, then it becomes very difficult to see how you cannot have knowledge of God by looking at reality. But Aquinas with Aristotle is far more optimistic when it comes to the capacities of our human mind, and he says, well, we can have knowledge of reality because due to this similarity of forms, to the possibility that we have one and the same forms in our intellect and in the things themselves. So there is no skepticism which can enter there. It's not a representationalism. So you have a very interesting theory of cognition there. You have a very interesting theory of metaphysics, according to which the whole reality is sacramental in a way, is a sign for God's presence. And yeah, you just from this perspective, it says, just look around. It's full of God's glory. It's all full of God's presence. And it also explains why it is not so obscure to say that God even dwells in us, is present in us by giving us essence. Because, well, our form he gives to us, our essence, is already pre-existing in God's mind. So there is a connection there. And I think you have a very powerful and interesting picture of reality, which is, I think, not only interesting for religious thinkers, but also I think for contemporary debates in epistemology and metaphysics. Okay, I think I've said enough. I would like to conclude with that, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for a lovely lecture. We are now open for questions.